Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're diving into a fascinating period, one that doesn't get a ton of attention, at least not in this much detail. We're talking about the boyhood of Jesus.
It's true. Most people only think about the Jesus of the Gospels, already doing miracles and teaching.
Exactly. But there were years leading up to all that, years that must have played a huge role in shaping who he became. And thankfully, we have the Urantia book to give us some incredible insights into that period.
It's really a unique perspective because it's not so much about theology, like trying to prove anything about his divinity or anything. It's more like a biography, almost. We get these glimpses into his human development.
Okay, so let's jump right in. We're talking about Jesus growing up in Nazareth, right?
Yeah.
What was Nazareth like back then? I mean, it wasn't exactly a bustling metropolis.
No, not at all like, say, Alexandria. And, Alexandria was kind of the place to be back then if you were really looking for a top-notch education. It was like the center of intellectual and cultural life, really cosmopolitan.
So why Nazareth then? What was it about that environment that influenced him?
Well, the Urantia book describes it as a real crossroads, a melting pot, really. You had caravans constantly coming and going from all over, bringing in goods, and more importantly, people from all walks of life, merchants, traders, travelers, all with their own cultures and beliefs.
So young Jesus would have been exposed to all these different languages, customs, everything.
Exactly. And I think you can see how those early exposures to such diversity might have planted the seeds for the kind of inclusive message that he would later preach, right? This idea of connecting with people from all backgrounds, no matter who they were, where they came from.
That's a really interesting point. I never quite thought about it like that before. And it's interesting because the book doesn't shy away from the more ordinary parts of his life either. Like, it actually talks about him having normal childhood illnesses.
Yeah, it's kind of refreshing, actually. No divine immunity from the sniffles, I guess. It really reinforces the idea that he lived a real, relatable human experience, even as a child.
It makes you think about how he balanced that, right? This awareness of something extraordinary within him, but also just living the life of a normal kid. And
Yeah.
speaking of extraordinary, one of the things the Urantia book highlights is his love of art, right? Like, he loved to draw and sculpt.
Absolutely, and that really stood out even back then, especially in a culture where those kinds of activities, well, they weren't always seen as, I guess you could say, religiously appropriate, right? Some people had strict interpretations of what was considered acceptable, and art sometimes pushed those boundaries.
So even as a child, he was already challenging the status quo a bit. It's like he had this inherent drive to express himself, explore his creativity, even if it meant, ruffling a few feathers along the way.
Yeah, definitely. And that curiosity, that thirst for knowledge, it wasn't limited to art. The Urantia book talks about how he was captivated by nature, by the workings of the physical world around him.
Right. Like the states of water, for example. He was fascinated by how something could be solid ice one minute, then flowing water, and then just disappear into the air as vapor.
It's like his senses were just heightened to the wonders of creation. He saw these profound truths hidden in plain sight, things that most people just took for granted. It reminds me of those nature documentaries where they zoom in on like a drop of water and you see this whole teeming world that you never even knew existed.
And maybe those early observations, those moments of awe and wonder, maybe they influenced his teachings later on. When you think about it, Jesus was a master of taking something ordinary, like a seed or a shepherd, and revealing these profound spiritual truths through them.
It's true. There's a real beauty in the way he could take something so simple and make it resonate on this whole other level. And that reminds me, he wasn't just content to observe. This kid, he loved to debate. He'd really dive deep into intellectual conversations.
Yeah, I remember reading about that in the Urantia book. You even mentioned an incident where he challenges this tradition of the doorpost parchment as a kid.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic story. It really shows you how he was wired even then.
Okay, but for those of us who aren't up on our ancient Jewish customs, what exactly is a doorpost parchment?
Sure. So back then, it was common practice to have these little scrolls, right? And they'd be inscribed with verses from the scriptures, and people would attach them to, well, their doorposts.
Okay, like a daily reminder of their faith.
Exactly. And when people would pass by, they'd touch the parchment and then kiss their fingers as a sign of reverence.
Okay, so something considered very sacred.
Mm-hmm.
So what was Jesus's issue with that?
Well, see, he saw it as a contradiction. He pointed out that they were taught against making idols, worshiping physical objects. And here they were revering this scroll. It's like he was saying, shouldn't our devotion be directed inward, not towards something external?
I can see how that would ruffle some feathers.
Ugh.
It's like he was already challenging the established dogma, even as a kid.
Absolutely. He had this innate ability to see through to the heart of the matter, to cut through the rituals and traditions to the deeper meaning beneath.
And this independent streak of his, it sounds like it really became more pronounced as he got older, right? Like during his adolescence.
Oh, definitely. The Urantia book talks about how, unlike most teenagers who just want to hang out with their friends, Jesus actually preferred the company of older, more intellectually stimulating people.
Interesting. So like deep philosophical discussions instead of, whatever the ancient equivalent of video games was.
Exactly. They debate everything under the sun: philosophy, ethics, even politics and economics.
Wow, that's pretty heady stuff for a teenager.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what those adults saw in him, you know? What was it about this young boy that drew them into these complex conversations?
It speaks to a mind that was already grappling with life's big questions, a soul that wasn't content with surface level answers. He was a seeker, even then. And this intellectual curiosity, it went beyond just philosophical debates, too. Remember the story about his trip to Scythopolis?
Right, the Greek city.
Yeah.
That was significant, wasn't it?
Very much so. It offered a stark contrast to the more conservative Jewish culture he was raised in. Imagine you're 11 years old and you're exposed to this entirely different way of life. The architecture, the art, the whole atmosphere. It would have been eye-opening, to say the least.
Okay, so I'm trying to picture this through the eyes of an 11-year-old boy. What would have stood out to him the most?
Well, the text mentions his fascination with the grand open-air theater they had there and this beautiful temple made of marble. Structures like that would have been completely different from anything he'd seen in Nazareth.
And remember, there was a pretty big cultural and religious divide between the Jews and the Greeks back then.
Oh, absolutely. The Greeks, with their emphasis on physical beauty and, let's just say, a more relaxed approach to religious practices, they were seen as pretty scandalous by a lot of the stricter Jewish folks.
So how did young Jesus react to all of that? Was he put off by it?
Not at all. He was totally enthralled by it. In fact, he even suggested that Nazareth should adopt something similar to the Greek games he witnessed at the amphitheater.
Wait, like the Olympics?
Well, similar, but on a smaller scale. These games were all about physical prowess, competition, things that weren't really emphasized in the same way in Jewish culture.
Interesting. So even at that young age, he was already, like, looking beyond his own cultural boundaries, finding inspiration in unexpected places.
Exactly. And, the book even mentions that this fascination with the games caused a bit of friction with his father, Joseph.
It makes you wonder if maybe there's a connection there, right? Like between his early appreciation for the Greek emphasis on physical excellence and how he later approached healing. I mean, he placed a lot of importance on addressing both the physical and spiritual needs of people.
That's a fascinating thought. It suggests a worldview that saw those two aspects of our being as interconnected, which of course became a central theme in his later teachings.
It's like he was already piecing together elements of his philosophy, even as a young boy, drawing from all these different sources. But for now, he's still a teenager, about to enter manhood, and dealing with all that entails identity, responsibility, not to mention the expectations that come with being, well, Jesus.
And those expectations are only going to get more complicated as he embarks on a journey that will change everything.
You're talking about the family pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover.
Exactly. It's a coming-of-age experience for any young Jewish boy, but for Jesus, it becomes a major turning point.
So we're picking up with a 13-year-old Jesus traveling to Jerusalem with his family for Passover. I mean, can you imagine the excitement? This was a huge deal, especially back then.
Oh, absolutely. This was a pilgrimage steeped in centuries of tradition, And for a young Jewish boy, it marked this important transition into adulthood. The Urantia book even calls it becoming a son of the commandment.
Right, I remember reading that. What does that actually mean, though? Like, what did it entail for a young man to become a son of the commandment?
Well, it basically meant taking on the full weight of religious responsibility. From that point forward, he was considered an adult within the Jewish community, bound by all the laws and traditions.
Wow, that's a lot to put on a 13-year-old's shoulders. And then to experience the grandeur of Jerusalem for the first time? I mean, the city itself must have been awe-inspiring, especially for someone coming from a smaller town like Nazareth.
The Urantia book actually describes how deeply moved Jesus was by the whole experience, especially the temple. He was struck by its magnificence, the sheer scale of it all. But, even amidst all that, those earlier questions he had about things like animal sacrifice, they never really went away.
It's like he was constantly searching for deeper meaning, even, or maybe especially, when confronted with the weight of tradition.
Exactly. He wasn't content to just accept things at face value. And this is where things take a really interesting turn. The book describes how, during a night of deep contemplation, a celestial messenger appears to Jesus.
Okay, talk about a life-changing moment. This is where he gets the, official call to action, right?
You could say that. The messenger's words are simple but powerful. The hour has come. It is time that you began to be about your Father's business.
Wow. Just hearing that, it sends chills down my spine. You get this sense of destiny unfolding, a path being laid out before him.
Exactly. And from this point forward, there's this noticeable shift. He's increasingly aware of his unique purpose, this cosmic role he's meant to play.
But at the same time, he's still got this very real human life to live. And let's not forget, his father, Joseph, is getting up there in years. Jesus is about to become the head of his family, responsible for his mother and his younger siblings.
And that's what I find so compelling about the Urantia Book's account, this portrayal of Jesus navigating these dual realities. He's got this growing awareness of his divine nature, his mission, yet he continues to live a seemingly ordinary life, fulfilling his responsibilities.
It really makes you think about the nature of faith, doesn't it? How do we balance this sense of calling, this bigger purpose, with the demands of our everyday lives? It's a question we all wrestle with on some level, I think. Well, that is all the time we have for this week's deep dive. It's been fascinating to explore this often overlooked period of Jesus' life, to catch these glimpses of the person he was before the world knew his name. From the bustling streets of Nazareth to the grandeur of Jerusalem, these formative experiences, these questions, and these revelations undoubtedly shaped the man who would forever change the course of history. Join us next time as we delve deeper into the mysteries and the humanity of Jesus.